All right, welcome everybody. Lesson number 2. Native Americans of North America. Yep, that is correct. What I am doing. So, Native Americans of North America. We've already talked at length about the, and you all probably read Native Americans in America. Now we're going to zero in, because the story of the United States of America really begins in North America. So, without further ado, so first, civilizations. One of the common misconceptions that many students of history have is that the main civilizations of the Americas are in South and Central America, right? The Mayans, the Aztec, and the Inca, and that's because they are the most well known. There are 2 others. Both of them made their homes in the lands which now are part of the modern day United States. So let's take a look at something. First, we have the Mound Builders, also called the Mississippians. Now, they were a medieval civilization. In fact, their main city, while they existed, was actually larger than the population of London at the same time. How about that? It's quite interesting. They built large walled cities, as well as burial mounds and various mounds for solar observation. Very intelligent. They had a religion, of course, the sun, and they were contemporaries with Mayans. They were trading with the Mayans. We found Mayan artifacts in Mississippian settlements. So it's very possible that they had a trading relationship there. Now they collapsed before European arrival, so we don't really see the conquest of the Mississippians, the Mound Builders, the same way we see the Aztec, the Inca, or civilizations such as that. Now, an interesting fact is, and now we have to talk about a lovely term here, a little bit of ethnocentrism. See, when archaeologists first uncovered the remains of the Mound Builder civilization in the 19th century, their expectations for Native Americans and Native American culture were so low that they refused to admit that locals of the Mississippi Valley could have built this civilization. So where do they think it came from? Well, actually, you got the bonkers thing, right? You got things. So you can see on certain shows hosted by certain people on YouTube. I'm not going to name names. So, some of them believe that some ancient and fabled people from back in the old world must have made it over. Some said, this is proof of Atlantis. Others said, no. It's the 12, it's the lost tribes of Israel. They must have left Assyria and made it here somehow. Truth be told, Atlantis, no. 10 tribes of Israel, they're not lost because they're wandering, they're lost because they're dead. A professor who's a rabbi used to mention, yeah, they're dead. No, this was built by an actual Native American civilization, so that's a cool thing to observe. Anasazi. So the Anasazi, we talked a little bit about the Anasazi in the past. The Anasazi were natives of the area around Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, that kind of area, in the Southwest. And they built what was fascinating pueblos or villages carved into the side of the mountain. You can see here, this is a cliff that overshadows this mountain. And these house sections are entered and exited by ladders. And it collapsed with water. Area dried up, no water. Fun thing about being a human being, you need water to live. So, bye-bye, and stop. As we talked about last time, there is a theory held by many historians that the Anasazi are actually the progenitors of the Aztec people. That when their civilization dried up, that disappeared, just like the slide did. But it went from a verdant green landscape, one devoid of all that precious clean water. What happened ultimately is that they collapsed, and that people, like always happens when civilization falls, they look to rebuild. And that what they did ultimately is they left their ruined metropolis, they left their ruined city, and they found their way to a new home. And that the belief is that it is these people who may have been the Aztecs of old, right? Described in their legends and their creation myth, they describe themselves as coming up from a subterranean world, right? Well, you notice here that these pueblos built under the cliffs. They're coming up out from underground, under the cliffs, and now they're moving southward, and eventually that southward movement brings them into a position to find, take and teach them. That's it. Now, do we have proof of this? No. So why am I telling it to you? Well, because it helps us get a little bit more of a history. Far too often, our version of history of the First Nations, the Native Americans, and the American Indians, however you like to refer to these folks, different names, same with people. We often act like, oh, they were just this, verdant wilderness. It's just no. And Europeans showed up and they built something, or we almost treat these civilizations like props. They're settings in which conquerors come into and just start training things. But that's not it. These were dynamic cultures with their own history, their own struggles, their own ways of life. So it's a disingenuous portrayal. That's why I wanted to bring up the possibility of learning a little more of the interplay between these civilizations, right? The Mayans weren't just a step here. They had a trading partner over in Mississippi. The Aztecs didn't just grow out of the ground near Tenochtitlan. They may well have originated as refugees from another civilization. All right. Let's talk a little bit about tribal societies. So, for most Native Americans in North America, they did not build giant urban centers. They remained in small tribal communities. Now, a lot of people like to give flack to these names because they didn't form cities. It's important to remember, even to this day in our modern society, large numbers of people choose not to live in cities. So it's not necessarily an indictment on one's cultural sophistication, whether or not they choose to build a city, or whether they choose to remain living amongst nature and the trees. Now again, I may preface my own bias. I like living up north. I like the north. So let's talk a little bit about tribal societies. So tribal societies were about as diverse as they get. Some remain hunter-gatherers, just like the Paleolithic Native American hold. Others settled down and became sedentary farmers. They lived their lives growing the food from the land, hunting occasionally to add some well-needed protein to their diet. They never developed the large urban centers. Now, how they organized themselves varies. Most hunter-gatherer societies were patriarchal and patrilineal. So patriarchy, meaning ruled by father, and that means they were led by male leaders. That's that word patriarchy. Patriarchy means men are in charge, right? Occasionally, men is one friend that says, smash the patriarchy. That's it. And patrilineal means that descent is traced through the male line. So things like last names, whose family, couple that's together, whose family they live closer to, who they live near. In a patrilineal society, the husband is the father, right? So it's when you did the Middle Ages, I remember living about a lineage, right, where it's about me and my father and my son and his son, that kind of like to male line. Now, many of the agrarian societies, see, in those societies, particularly up in the Iroquois, the norm was that women did the farming. Because women did the farming, a lot of society, at least in terms of family organization, it was matrilineal. It's basically the mother's line. So it isn't about me and my father and my grandfather and my son and my grandson. It's about my wife. I don't actually have wishful thinking on my part. And her mother and her grandmother and her daughter and her granddaughter. That's how the family line is traced. So lineage, matrilineal. Matrilineal, matrilineal. Cool. Now that my little dancer teach them, let's talk a little more about this. So that is something that happens. So in most cases, a man would get married and he would go live in the longhouse of his wife's family. And in many of these societies, while they weren't full matriarchies, they weren't 100% run by women. Women had a lot more say. So that's what the fact is. All right, so tribal nations. Most of North America was dominated by various tribal nations. Now, the languages and the cultures of these tribes were intensely varied. Again, we sometimes paint them all as the broad brush of being Native Americans and say, oh, well, Native American culture is this, Native American culture is that. Not really. There are multiple tribal nations who may agree or disagree with each other on any given concept. And so just to give you a little taste of it, let's talk just about building structures. So where do you live, right? You can tell a lot about a community from where people live, right? So tell a lot about a community from how people live, right? You're living in a countryside like this, a forest like that, you're going to have a different way of life, right? Look around you, right? Think about your neighborhood. Think about where people live, where you live. Now, how does that compare to people in other parts of the country or other parts of the state? I bring this up something we have to think about. So, if we take a look at this is an example. The tribes out in the West, where they hunted buffalo, lived in what we call teepees, which are tents made of buffalo skin. Now, up north, where there's less buffalo, there's a lot more wood. By the Iroquois Confederation and their longhouse, multi-family dwelling. Now, in the southern part of the U.S., they are called the wigwam, built out of thatch and mud, peat moss. It's sort of like a igloo made out of twigs. But notice, even here, we have some differences, right? These are teepees are very temporary structure, designed to be assembled and disassembled by nomadic people. A longhouse and a wigwam are both more permanent, tend to stay. Right? The longhouse uses more timber. Why? Timber is plentiful in the Northeast. In the Southeast, they're using peat moss. Why? Because if you're in the bogs down in the Carolinas, you've got a lot more peat moss than you use solid hardwood lumber. So let's talk about some big ones. For us, it's the Iroquois. Why? Because they lived right here in New York. So they were a confederation of tribes. And the word confederation or confederacy makes some of y'all get uneasy. Don't get uneasy on me. That word is pejorated right there. That word has a very negative connotation means to be, Confederate States of America. But it's important to say that the Confederacy that we call the Confederacy in America is not the first Confederation. They didn't invent the top. Yeah, they weren't the first by a long shot. The Iroquois had a Confederation. What that means is it's a loose-knit alliance, right? It is an alliance of various member states, or in this case, member tribes, that come together for certain basic defensive functions, but otherwise the main level of sovereignty is still the tribe. That's what it means they're a confederation. Now, they were ruled by a council of chiefs. Each of these chiefs was elected by their tribe. And each of the families of these tribes were headed by elderly women. So, this is a very democratic structure. Women who get together and help to elect various chiefs to come together democratically. And all this is done simply in the name of waging war with the Algonquin, who lived north of the Iroquois in what is now Canada. So, Native American warfare. So, one thing that surprises a lot of people about Native American warfare is when we think of Native American warfare, we often have the image of the ambush style, right? The natives popping out from behind trees and rocks, and firing a bow, and then disappearing. No, that's not how the natives fought. At least not before the Europeans arrived. Most of them fought across each other in long rows, very similar to how medieval archers fight, and they fire their longbows or recurve bows across the field at each other. Many of them wore wood armor to help protect themselves from arrows. So they use a recurve bow, which helped increase the effectiveness of their arrows. Now, all of this changed when Europeans arrived. See, when Europeans arrived, the reason we have this image of Native Americans as fighting this ambush style isn't because that's naturally how tribes fought. It was an adaptation when confronted with European firearms. See, wood armor was relatively effective against things like arrowheads, flint or obsidian arrowheads, or spears, is relatively ineffective against a fast-moving projectile like a bullet. And to help explain that to you, I have this handy chart. You don't have to copy this down. You may find it interesting. For the science buffs among you. So this is a ballistic comparison. So this chart shows recurve bows over there and long bows over there. And it shows based on the metric called knot to point tip. Knot is the little wedge at the end of an arrow where the spring goes in. The tip is going to tip the arrow. So the fastest speeds they have are for a light 25 grain or less, 23-inch arrow. While from a recurve bow, you will get a speed of about 600 feet per second. Now that's pretty fast. What that means, 600 feet per second. To give you a comparison, just to put that in perspective, right? 600 feet. There's 3 feet in a yard. Football field is 100 yards. 300. Basically, football field is about 300 feet. What that means is that arrow will fly the distance of 2 football fields. 2 football fields in a second. That's what that means. That means that if I am standing here with this bow, it's going to go 600 feet in a second. It could cross that football field and then a whole nother football field in the same amount of time, as a second. Now, does it actually go all 600 feet? Maybe not. Now, just to give you a comparison, now it doesn't mean your accurate range is 600, just you can theoretically get that. Now, let's take a look down here. This chart is a little harder to see down here, has bullet specifications. So, most guns around the time shot the equivalent of 40 or 50 caliber. So notice, if you look down here at 45, it's going about 833 feet per second. So that means even your lightest, nimblest arrow, right, means very short, tiny little tip, is still not going to be able to move anywhere near as fast or even one of the largest, slowest moving bullets. So, in short, the kind of armor that can stand up to the force of an arrow, when you have a projectile that's moving that fast, it takes a while to stop. And that's why this wood armor failed, and that's part of why we get this distinctive style of combat. So this has been our highlight. We got to talk a little bit about more things. So next we got to talk about land ownership. So tribal nations own land communally. Yeah. This is pure communism, right? Doesn't mean that people had no property, right? So Native American societies had movable property, right? Movable property or personal property means, something like this skateboard, right? This skateboard is movable property. Right? So this skateboard belongs to Summit. So this is Summit Academy's movable property for our kids right now. So this is their movable property, right? So what does that mean? Movable property, right? It's personal effect. That is no different. Lots of natives have personal effect, right? This is my spear, this is my bow, this is the fish I just caught. You get the idea. But land is different. Land, what we call real estate or real property, they thought of as communal ownership, right? In other words, there's a concept of this land belongs to this tribe. anyone who tries to take that from us, who tries to use it without our consent, fine. But the notion of I as an individual own this land, that really didn't register. So, even the notion of land ownership was kind of odd. There was no sort of tribe. Occupy land and control land, use the land. If you're coming in trying to use the land I'm using, we're going to have a problem. But that it's actually your property, that didn't really register. And this, combined with traditional gift exchange rituals among Native American communities, led to a lot of confusion. In short, to Europeans, when Europeans eventually show up, this becomes an issue because to Europeans, yeah, you can own land. It's normal. I, as a person, can own a piece of land. It's mine, and whether I'm actively using it right now or not, it's still mine. I can kick anybody else out. I will not. And then you can buy that land from someone and transfer it like that. That's normal. So while many Europeans did just take land illicitly, others did try to buy it. The trouble was, to the natives, they really couldn't even fathom how you own the land. How you own the land? You can't pick it up and take it with you. How do you own the land? That was a problem. It's the same way we would have trouble contemplating if someone said, hey, I want to buy the air in this room. How are you going to do that? How are you going to enforce that? What? Right, that's how they're kind of looking at the Europeans when they say, hey, we want to buy the land. And to make everything more confusing, because it was normal for tribes to exchange gifts during certain occasions, particularly between like guests and hosts and things like that. When the Europeans show up and say, hey, we want to buy this land here, and we're going to give you, X amount of gold, X amount of iron, X amount of tools for this land, they don't understand it as a transaction. Why you want to live on the land with us, and as guests, you're giving us this nice gift. And so that's where you start to get this breakdown in communication. And that breakdown is one of the things that's going to lead to a lot of stress. Religion. So Native American religion varied intensely between societies. Some were polytheists. They had multiple gods and goddesses. Others practiced animism. They venerated nature and nature spirits. Still others had some version of ancestor veneration, of ancestor worship. They didn't pull out to the gods or to the spirits of nature, it was the spirits of their ancestors that they call upon to help distress. And some had some combination of all of the above. Finally, we got to talk about gender roles. Now, granted, a big danger in broad brushing. Well, let's talk about it. One, women tend to be involved in farming and are married. As a result, societies that were primary means of getting nutrition was through farming tended to have more prominence on women than under average society. So women had a lot of power in the Iroquois, whereas a tribe like the Apache or Creek or someone like that out farther west, not as much power. I know they have to be taken. Maybe try to give you an idea. The term Apaches are named the Apache French version. Apache is the English translation, French mistranslation of the Native American word, an enemy, what all the other tribes call this particular term. free-spirited people. Now again, some cultures did this, some didn't. Free-spirited people refer to individuals who are transgender, or else gender non-binary. We call them that. We call them individuals in our secular society today. But among some traditional Native American people, they were called true-spirited people. And these individuals this was a much more socially acceptable thing in a lot of these societies. In most cases, upon reaching maturity, the individual would elect to live life as a gender, even if that didn't correlate with the sex they were assigned at birth. In the Southwest, some of the tribes, I believe it's the Hopi, not certain, would carry out a ritual known as the ritual of the basket and bow. The basket being the traditional symbol of the woman that's gatherer of man, hunter. And so when an individual came of age, they would choose the basket and bow. Normally, most young men, most what we would now consider to be cisgender men, would choose bow, cisgender women basket. But there were select people who were either gender non-binary or transgender, gender fluid, and as a result, they might choose different. So while they might be assigned male at birth, they might choose biologically male. They may choose the basket. And vice versa. Two-spirited individuals would henceforth and live and society based on that gender identity. In some cultures, they would though still be buried based on what they were assigned at birth. So even if they had lived their whole life in the traditionally male role of society, they were born differently than their burial, like their birth. Every culture has its own way of handling things. So that is Native American gender roles in a nutshell. Now I'm speaking in very broad generalizations here. So we will talk more about this later on. But now in the next class, we are going to take a closer look at the peoples of Africa and what their experience is being brought rather unwillingly into this American experiment. So I hope you all enjoyed that lecture.